And good evening again. My name is Ted Baker. I'm a Union League member, a volunteer at Founding Forward, and a big supporter of all that Founding Forward does. And it's my great pleasure this evening to welcome you to tonight's Jack Templeton Liberty Series program. Now, for all of you who are frequent flyers at these programs, you know that we typically begin with a sales pitch and a what we're doing from Mr. Miko. But tonight we decided to one-up him a little bit and have prepared a video. So I ask you to turn your attention to our screen, to my left, to see what Senior Fellow Professor Joe LeConte has to say about Founding Forward's work. Roll the tape.
When the Americans launched their revolution back in 1776, they had one gigantic worry, that it would fail. Factions, corruption, and political violence brought down the best of governments. Yes, with the Declaration and the Constitution, the founders created a framework for liberty. They gave us a republic based on limited government, on the separation of powers, and on the concept that all men are created equal. But without responsible citizens, grounded in the principles of self-government, the American experiment is headed for trouble. And that is the mission of Founding Forward, to educate students, teachers, and the wider community about the American story, to renew the concept of American citizenship, of our rights as well as our obligations for today. Founding Forward immerses people in the places where history happened. In Philadelphia, the city that gave birth to the most successful democratic revolution in the history of the world. And at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where George Washington and his Continental Army rescued the American cause from catastrophe. Well, what better places to learn about our history, about courage, about leadership, about the responsibilities of citizenship? Each year, thousands of students come from all over the country to step into this history. They stay at our 75-acre campus in Valley Forge. They engage with our chapters and partners through national programs and awards. They walk in the very footsteps of those revolutionaries who pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor in the fight for freedom.
It was amazing to learn history where it happened.
It's not obsolete. It's still influencing our country today. It's still influencing me today.
We went over the Bill of Rights and how our founding document really impacts what we do every day.
Founding Forward also educates and inspires teachers from around the country, providing professional development they can't get anywhere else. At the Union League's Liberty Hill campus outside of Philadelphia, teachers engage with some of the nation's leading historians and scholars of the American founding.
It's a place where people who are passionate about their students can sit, talk, wrestle with big ideas with some of the smartest brains in the nation.
Founding Forward understands how to recharge the batteries of a teacher.
There's something we can bring back to the classroom for our students, which is really the ultimate goal.
Students, teachers, and citizens gain access to one of the jewels of American history, the Union League of Philadelphia. The League was founded in 1862 to support President Lincoln, the abolition of slavery, and the preservation of the Union. With its public lectures, debates, exhibits, and educational programs, the Union League embodies the founders' vision of responsible citizenship. Founding Forward is much more than an educational initiative. It is a movement to renew the concept of American citizenship, to preserve our bold experiment in human freedom. So, come join us and help us to ensure an American future rooted in liberty, what Abraham Lincoln called the last best hope of Earth.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited about our work at Founding Forward, almost as excited as Joe. And we thank you for your support. As you know, Founding Forward is funded completely through donations from members. So I ask that to the extent that you have not gotten involved, and this video has gotten you as excited as me, that you're a frequent attender of these lectures, we ask you to become a sponsor of Founding Forward through your time or your talent and treasure. So some housekeeping items tonight. We ask you to silence your cell phones. So we take care of that normal piece of business, and I'll tell you a little bit about how we're going to do things tonight. We'll start with a discussion with our panelists, and followed by Q&A from all of you. So please write your questions on the index cards that have been left on your seats, and staff members will be around throughout the program to collect them. We also appreciate your feedback about this program and others, and there is a QR code on one of the handouts that you also have on your seats. So we invite you to scan that afterwards and provide some information and your thoughts. Looking ahead, a programming note. Our next program will be Monday, November 24th, which is titled Man and Myth, Sculpting Lincoln with Harold Holzer. It will be held here at the Lig House and focus on the story of Otto Schweitzer, the sculptor of the Lig's Abraham Lincoln statue, which, as you know, is just above us. So now I'll ask our panel, Charles Cooke and John Miko, to join me on stage as I introduce them. Charles C.W. Cooke is a senior writer at the National Review and hosts the Charles C.W. Cooke Podcast. He's the author of the Conservatarian Manifesto. His work has focused especially on Anglo-American history, British liberty, free speech, the Second Amendment, and American exceptionalism. Charles is a graduate of the University of Oxford, at which he studied modern history and politics. He moved to the United States in 2011 and has become an American citizen in 2018. We all know John Miko. He is our founding forward president. So it is my pleasure, my honor, to have both of these gentlemen here for tonight's program, and I ask you to bid them warm welcome.
Thank you, Ted, and thank you, Charlie, for being with us. It's a great honor that you're here with us. I know there's a lot of fans here, and we're looking forward to tonight. William F. Buckley would have turned 100. I think it's on Monday, if I'm not mistaken. And I won't assume that everyone knows who he is, but how did you, a guy who grew up in England, outside of Cambridge, come to know William F. Buckley?
All right, well, thank you so much for having me here in this incredible setting. So I actually was apolitical growing up in England. I was fortunate enough to be born in the mid-1980s, and until I was 16, it seemed to me that very little bad ever happened. And the United States and Britain and the Western world in general were prevailing. The Cold War ended when the West went to war. It won quickly, as in 1991 in Iraq, as in Kosovo in 1998. The first thing that really happened in the world that gained my attention was September 11th. And I was living in a happy little ignorant bubble for 16 years. And I became politically aware on that day, but I didn't really have any politics. And so I started to look into people who did and read their opinions. And I would Google opinions that I thought I might agree with. And it led me to National Review. And I had a completely false impression, by the way, of how National Review worked, reading it from England. I thought everyone who wrote there worked in the same building, almost in a row. So I had this image of, Thomas Sowell sitting next to William F. Buckley, sitting next to Victor Davis Hanson, and them all chatting in cubicles, which is, of course, not how it was at all. But that was how I saw it. And the more that I read, the more I became interested in this way of thinking, but in particular in that magazine. And so through that, I discovered William F. Buckley. Now, of course, by that point, he was not the editor. He had slowed down to some extent. Firing Line had gone off the air. But it wasn't too hard, with the internet being as it was, to find video clips, articles, biographies, and so forth of William F. Buckley. So that's how I came to it.
How did you actually come to National Review? How did you get there?
Okay, so those of you who listen to any podcasts I'm on will know most of my stories start with drinking. And I was at my parents' house, and I had had the better part of 2 bottles of wine with my dad, and I read, as I often did, National Review on my iPad. and there was an article on the corner saying they were looking for an intern. And I thought, I could do that. Now, that was a 7-glass-of-wine decision, but I thought I could do that. And I wrote to them and I said, my name's Charles Cooke, I live in England, I really enjoy reading National Review. I think that I could be your summer intern. And then I didn't hear back for a month, and I thought, well, I sent that email after 7 glasses of wine. There is a place I know I will never work. But I got a phone call a month afterwards, and they asked me for writing samples. They gave me their famous editing test, and then I did a 45-minute phone interview. And then another month after that, they asked if I would go over and be their summer intern. And then they asked if I would stay after that, and that was 14 years ago. So, I will say just very briefly on this, this is actually something that's quite difficult to answer, because a lot of people I speak to on college campuses, they'll say, how do I insert something that isn't lawyer or doctor or airline pilot or what you will. And I think that there's an expectation often that there is a really clear way to get there, but there isn't. And I think that story shows how odd life can be, and so the crooked timber of life. And that's an element of conservatism I think is very important to point out to people, is that things are often chaotic and the product of drinking too much red wine on a Saturday night with your dad.
So let's talk about Buckley, his background, his upbringing, where did he come from, and what made the boy the man?
So William F. Buckley was born in New York City, but he grew up in lots of different places. One of them was Mexico. His first language is Spanish. He grows up in France as well. He speaks French. He then is in an English boarding school. English is in some sense his third language, his second or third depending on how you ask. But he then goes back to the United States, and he has a very cosmopolitan worldview. His dad is a Texas oil entrepreneur. He grew up very wealthy. He's one of 10 children, but he's used to the finer things in life. And I think all of that helps to explain him, in that he develops this strange accent. But that accent was maybe 10% affect, but 90% upbringing. That he says words differently because the first way his mouth was used to moving was in Spanish, then French, then in English boarding school, and finally back in America. But in the North, and his parents are Southerners, I mean, his brain must have been scrambled phonetically. And he then ends up at Yale, and Yale at that point is still a small aristocratic institution that is supposed at least to imbue its students with, I won't say finishing school, that's too much, but there is an aspect of that. So the Buckley that you see is the product of that mishmash.
So let's give us a sense. This is the late 40s into the early 50s when he comes of age. Give us a sense of the geopolitical and ideological setting that he grows up in and comes of age to, and then we'll set the stage for that conservative movement that he helps create.
Sure. Well, as I don't need to tell anyone here, given where we are, with a couple of exceptions, from the end of the American Civil War until 1932, the Republican Party dominated American life. And even when, there's a name I shouldn't say in this room, it's almost profanity, but even when Woodrow Wilson won, even when Woodrow Wilson won, he won because the Republicans split the vote between Taft and Theodore Roosevelt. So you have this period of American history in which a fairly diverse Republican Party is dominant. And then, of course, in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt wins the election in a landslide. And from that point until 1952, the Democrats win every presidential election, and not every congressional election, but most of them. And they become the party of government in the United States. And they change an enormous number of the underlying assumptions in American life. The New Deal coalition fundamentally reorders almost everything that has hitherto been the norm. So in 1950, 51, when William F. Buckley starts to become known, he is operating within that change. He is somebody who is not happy with this 2-decade-long hegemony. And at Yale, I'm sure we're going to come onto that in a moment, he is one of a few people who has not made his peace with it. And I think this is really important to understand, because the term conservative is an odd one in the American context. First off, here it means something different than it means in Europe, it means in Britain, where I was born. American conservatives are not thrown and altar types. They're not people who are happy with every element of the establishment. They are people who often are thrilled by the American Revolution, which was a revolution. You know, the day after the revolution, the most revolutionary person becomes a conservative, is the old line. But in 1950, 1951, William F. Buckley is, I don't mean this in his affect, but he's an angry young man. He does not like the status quo. He's not conservative of it. He doesn't wish to conserve it. He wishes to blow it up. And that's very important. We now see Buckley, especially because of his later years, as almost a statesman, as somebody who could win over people who are of a moderate disposition. But in 1950, 1951, Buckley is a radical.
So he leaves Yale, and he's not entirely thrilled about his 4 years there, and he writes a book.
He does. That book's called God and Man at Yale. It makes him instantly famous. The faculty at Yale are not thrilled by it. In fact, they say quite publicly in many cases that he is an ingrate, that he has used their name, the imprimatur of their name, but he is unwilling to, I suppose, sort of shut up and get on with it. And he was unwilling to shut up and get on with it. And that was a defining feature of the man. He is bothered by what he sees as an abdication or a departure from the Judeo-Christian tradition. Buckley is a Catholic. He's a devout Catholic. He was his whole life. And he regards Yale as having moved from its original purpose as a school that was given a dual mandate. One, to continue in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and two, to sell the American order as it had been understood prior to the New Deal and since the founding. And he thinks it's failing at that. It's worth saying this is interesting in the modern context, because one of the calling cries of modern conservatives is academic freedom. And what we want is debate on college campus. What we want is for people to be able to express themselves without being punished for it, either literally or in the classroom. But Buckley doesn't want that. Buckley thinks the universities play a role in forming young people, and that they are failing or refusing to do that. And in that sense, it's an interesting book, because if you read it within the Jonathan Haidt style worldview, you would think it was almost redolent of something that we would now associate with being on the left, which is this idea that universities should convey values to people.
So that book kind of launches him into the public conversation, and he becomes, I think it's fair to say, the leader of building a conservative movement. Talk about that conservative movement. What role did he play in putting it together, and what were the pieces of it?
Well, I see him very much as the facilitator. William F. Buckley Jr. was not the man who had all the ideas that made the conservative movement. What he was a visionary who was dissatisfied with the status quo, was a brilliant writer, was socially charming, charismatic, and knew how to bring together people who shared his general aim, although disagreed often profoundly on how to get there. So he founds National Review in 1955 in November, and he does so with a loan. He writes in the first ever edition that he hopes within a year that National Review will be profitable. It's 70 years later, and it's still not. National Review is a for-profit corporation that has never made a profit. But he hosts debates among people on the American right, and it's interesting that that term is used as much as conservative. He hosts debates between people who are extraordinarily sharp-elbowed with one another. if you go back to the magazine between 1955 and 1962, people who are friends, who do work in the same office in the way I imagined they would when I was 16, people are calling each other names. They're describing each other as traitors. They're suggesting that if their worldview prevails, then America will fall. But what happens over that time is a movement is forged by the sheer brilliance of the people involved. And so although they disagree with one another, you have William F. Buckley and Frank Meyer and Whittaker Chambers all writing in the same magazine. These are people who have very different worldviews. Many of them are ex-communists. That's a common theme, by the way, in National Review's history, is ex-communists to National Review. There's a pipeline there. I was never a communist, but he is able to facilitate this. And I think in this respect, National Review has maintained its role on the right over that 70-year period because it does two things. One, it holds and promulgates opinions. National Review puts out editorials that are intended to sway, and they are representative of the magazine. But it also fosters and encourages internal debate. And that's true now, it was true in 1980, it was true in 1955. And sometimes those internal debates change the editorial line. And so by the 1960s, NR has become a place where people who were once very far apart from one another politically have learned to live together, and he has created a coalition that simply did not exist prior to 1955.
So that coalition was a big tent, but not forever tent. And there were some groups and people that were in the tent at one point and then out. Talk about some of that, Joseph McCarthy, the John Birch Society, and others, but also what were you used the term representative of the magazine. What is the magazine representing? What are the fundamental values and principles of the magazine? So those two things.
Yeah, so I'll take the second one first. The magazine's credenda, very Buckley word, he called it, in 1955, I think is fresh now, 70 years later. If you read it, there are a few core principles that make total sense now and to which National Review still hews. One of them is fierce anti-communism. Now, in 1955, the threat was Russia. Now it is China. But this was its preoccupation, and frankly, its obsession until 1991. That's what most of the magazine was about historically. Second, support for the Constitution and for the principles that it protects, and a great fear of and contempt toward those who wish to replace it with something else, whether that was an older feudal system or a newer fashionable socialism. National Review has profoundly disliked that from the beginning. Another was support for Judeo-Christian society and values against moral relativism. That's right there in 1955. There's a great line in the first editorial where Buckley takes aim at Louis Brandeis, who said that while he prefers champagne to ditch water, he thinks there's no reason the Almighty should. And Buckley says this is absolute nonsense. You know, that is a rejection of reason. It's a rejection of humanity. It's a rejection of objective law. And then the last one would be support for the free market, which, funnily enough, that term wasn't used in the early issues of National Review. The term that was used was the price system, or the competitive price system, but that has been a constant. So NR has taken those positions, still does, and those are non-negotiables. I would add, and I understand people disagree on this, but I would add to that, we have always been a pro-life magazine. We don't run pro-choice content. There are other entities on the right that will, but National Review does not. Otherwise, everything is up for debate, and always has been. The second part of your question...
the tent, and McCarthy and others.
Yeah, so right from the beginning, you have people who are free marketeers, you have people who are anti-communists. You have people who would now be called paleo-conservatives. But the people Buckley said have no place within the movement are conspiracy theorists and anti-Semites. And you mentioned McCarthy as opposed to, say, the Birch Society. The John Birch Society in 1955 believed that Dwight Eisenhower, the general who won World War II, was a communist spy. That was not true. And as a result, they were pushed to the sidelines.
But it didn't happen immediately.
No, it didn't happen immediately. It took time in this debate that I'm describing. It went on for years. Whereas, say, Joseph McCarthy, of whom Buckley was more protective than perhaps I would have been, although who knows. But he was fundamentally right in the sense that there were actual Soviet agents within the US government. And I think that's a distinction. It's not just that the original National Review rejected people who held terrible views or were bigoted, but if their worldview was so far removed from anything that could be demonstrated, then they weren't useful. So Buckley was sort of more tolerant of McCarthy, but not tolerant at all of the John Birch Society because their grip on reality was limited.
So I first came to know Buckley through Firing Line. And Sunday night was, Buckley, and he had these just incredible performances of sorts. And so, Bryce, we have a clip from Firing Line. Could you show us that? The topic is Vietnam. You can't quite hear it, but when he says, I didn't quite put it that way, he said, that's a direct quote. And his answer is, yes. I don't know how you recover from an introduction like that. I mean,
Well, what's interesting about that, one of the things that's interesting about that is that we had at some point in American history enough patience to watch a show like that. I mean this sincerely. I'm not being facetious.
Yeah.
I mean, I have recently declined frequently to go on cable news shows because if you do, you end up spending an hour getting there and back and makeup, and then you sit in the chair and you look at the camera, and then you speak for 2.5 minutes, and then they interrupt you and shout at you, and then you go home. Mm-hmm. And he got a minute, probably 2, to introduce his guest. And if you watch the rest of that episode, they really do talk at length and properly, and they cover real issues. And
they argue.
And they argue. And it wasn't just that show, although that show was obviously exceptional in its own way. If you go back and you watch a random episode of the Dick Cavett Show from the 70s, you find the same thing, open questions and open answers. And the fact that existed is remarkable in and of itself, but the fact that PBS allowed a conservative of great wit and eloquence to beat up progressives day in, day out for 35 years is also remarkable. And I think that a huge amount for American conservatism and for America too.
It ran from 66 to 99, I believe. It's the longest running public affairs program in history. And had all kinds of, been running through these, Muhammad Ali and the Black Panthers. And it's amazing to see William F. Buckley and one of the Black Panthers agreeing on so many things, which is just remarkable. Not everything, but on a lot. Yes, that's how I think most people got to know William F. Buckley, at least from my generation. So a question, who listens to the editor's podcast on National Review? Okay. Well, if you don't, you got to listen to it. It's really a remarkable program. It's great fun. My wife and I never miss it. And I want to kind of turn to that, and then maybe we can talk about some more current things. Talk about the show, what it has become, because I think when it started, it wasn't what it is now. And how do you guys do it? Like, what's the format? How do you just put it? Are you really just riffing? It feels like that sometimes, but tell us a little bit about the show.
No, it feels like that because we are riffing.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, when we've done live versions of the show, we always introduce this the same way because people can see it, so we can't hide it. But the basic gist of it is about half an hour before it starts, the host of it, Rich Lowry, who's the editor of National Review, will text everyone, what do you want to talk about today? Then there'll be a few suggestions. Then we go into the recording environment. We're all remote, and we talk about sports for 20 minutes, much to the chagrin of our producer, who doesn't care about sports at all. And eventually she will say, could we actually do the job we're here to do? And then we just talk to each other for an hour, but we don't interrupt each other and we don't shout at each other. And it's not the same as that, but it is in some sense an attempt to replicate the generosity of spirit there and to avoid the pitfalls of cable news. Because if I sound as if I'm really annoyed with cable news, I am. I really don't think this is a good way of getting across divisions in American life. And we are very much divided as a country. We're perhaps less divided than we think we are. And thank goodness for our federal system, where people can live in places that more closely comport to their version of the good life. But the worst thing you can do when you are a country divided is to argue with each other in 1 or 2 minute segments between commercials in which people get angry with one another. And the editor's podcast is designed to avoid that. Now, it is a National Review production, and therefore everyone on there is some flavor of conservative. The point of it, as I said, is the second part of NR's mission, which is to have intramural debate and flesh it out. And I think we do that because we have people on each week who disagree with each other a great deal and both think they're conservative, and then we decide who's right.
So you've used the word conservative a lot, but we were talking earlier, and your book, Conservatarian, which was mentioned, libertarian, conservative, was Buckley a libertarian, a conservative? And talk about this idea of both.
Well, I think he was both. Yeah, the book I wrote was the Conservatarian Manifesto. I didn't make that word up. It was something other people said, and I picked up on. It's not a particularly attractive word. It's better than liberservative, which is the alternative, but it's not a great word. But I think the gist of it was people would say to me, when I'm around libertarians, I feel conservative, and when I'm around conservatives, I feel libertarian. There seem to be a lot of people in that boat. And so I wrote a book about it. Now, there are, of course, lots of people before me who had addressed the same topic and had inspired and done most of the thinking, frankly. One of them was Frank Meyer, who built what's come to be known as fusionism. There's two meanings of fusionism on the right. One is sort of we all get along and the conservatives and libertarians agree to disagree. And that was a real thing that National Review achieved. But the real meaning of it is the combination of liberty with virtue. And that was the insight that Frank Meyer had, the position he took. And I think it informed a lot of National Review's history. Buckley was interesting in that he never defined conservative. He did at various points try to write the great book on what a conservative is, and he never did it. Either he was too busy, and he was incredibly busy, or he felt that it was an impossible task. But he never did it. He called himself a conservative sometimes. He called himself a libertarian probably more often. But he was a combination of the two. And because of that, you get some interesting chapters in American life. For example, in 1975, the Democratic Party is opposed to the legalization of marijuana, but William F. Buckley Jr. is in favor of it. And that was a libertarian instinct that he had, that he maintained his whole life. On the other hand, there's a famous National Review article in which William F. Buckley Jr. suggests that homosexuals ought to have "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here" tattooed onto their buttocks, which at that point in history was a pretty conservative view to hold. So, you know, he was difficult to define. He was difficult to pin down. I think he flitted between those positions as well.
Do you think the conservative movement has changed, and how has it changed since Buckley's death? right? So he dies in 2004. Is that correct? Do I have it?
8, yeah.
2008. And a lot has changed, but how's the conservative movement changed? And then we can talk about maybe some more current and present things.
Well, I think one of the big things that's changed is in many ways he won. A lot of people now ask this question very derisively, what has conservatism conserved? I think it's crazy. I mean, National Review in 1955 is worried that not only will communism prevail, but that it will win. I mean, Whittaker Chambers joins National Review as an ex-communist, and he tells Buckley, when he joins the magazine, that he believes himself to have joined the losing side. This was a real fear. And in 1991, communism collapsed. The Soviet Union collapsed. And that was maybe the main objective of National Review historically, and it won. National Review in 1964 backed Barry Goldwater, who lost in a landslide. 1980 backed Ronald Reagan, who won twice in landslides, and ushered in huge changes, many of which are still with us. If you look at the Supreme Court, after 50 years, Roe v. Wade was overturned. We now have an originalist majority that has picked up a lot of the positions that National Review argued for. So, of course, there are a lot of losses, there are a lot of failures. But the conservative movement, by definition, has changed because many of the objectives have been achieved. Also, it's changed because the circumstances in which we live have changed. And I think this is one reason Buckley found it difficult to write a book outlining in some high-level sense what conservatism was, because it does need to adapt to circumstance. And I think this is the most interesting thing about him. In 2000, he gave an interview in which he said that if he were starting out now, he would probably become a socialist. Now, people find that astonishing because they think he meant that he had changed his mind politically, but he hadn't. What he meant was he'd won, he was bored by it, and he wanted to fight again. And he makes this clear in the interview. He says, you know, who in the year 2000 was the most down in the dumps? And in his view, it was the socialists. And so that's what he wanted to do. He wanted to go back and start again and try and build this movement. And that's a sign of victory.
He was Irish. He did like
yeah.
He did like.
But it's also important because at various points in history, conservatives have to take a different approach to the status quo. So in 1955, Buckley's a fighter. But by 1985, he thinks he's winning, so he can become an elder statesman. By 1995, he's bored because he's winning so much. But if you look at contemporary politics, he died in 2008, so he hasn't seen it, but conservatism is more pugnacious again because conservatives think they're losing. And he understood that. So the movement element of this changes with the circumstance.
So the alignment of conservatives and party wasn't always a Republican thing. It has changed over time. It wasn't always clear that the progressives were on one side and so today we have a Republican Party that is it a conservative party? How has it changed since 2008? How's it changed since 2016? And talk about the conservative movement within the Republican Party.
Yeah, so before I get to that, it's worth pointing out that National Review historically has often been very antagonistic toward Republican presidents. I know a lot of people think this is a new thing, but the magazine was founded in part to act as a corrective against Eisenhower, who was not a communist, but was happy with the New Deal, and National Review was not. National Review was very unhappy with Richard Nixon for a lot of the 1970s, and the bit that gets forgotten is National Review was pretty unhappy with some of Ronald Reagan's decisions in the mid-1980s. In fact, there is an editorial in 1985 where Reagan goes and makes some deal on nuclear weapons, and the editorial reads, "This would never have happened if Ronald Reagan were still alive." The year before, he had been re-elected in a landslide with National Review's support. That issue, by the way, yielded maybe the funniest line in the history of National Review, which came from Joe Sobran, who unfortunately went on to go crazy. But in the 1980s, he wrote, when covering the debate on whether the United States should buy more nuclear weapons, that a good conservative ought to believe that the United States should purchase no new nuclear weapons until it had used the ones it had. So we've often been antagonistic toward Republican presidents, and that's because the mythology that has grown up, partly as a result of many victories, has been that the Republican Party and conservatism are the same thing. But for a lot of history, they weren't. And for a lot of history, we had the divides that we see now, where on the one side you have the free marketeers, what you would now call the Reagan conservatives, and on the other hand, you have the critics. I mean, in the 1950s, Eisenhower was seen as an adventurist abroad, and you had the Senator Taft faction of the party that was isolationist. In 1992, Pat Buchanan challenged the sitting president of the United States in a primary and won 20% of the vote. And so I think a lot of what we see now in the party with its divisions is the result of people and movements and thoughts and arguments that have been there for a very long time. And National Review has sort of flitted between them, but it has very often been uncomfortable with the state of the Republican Party and seen it as being distinct from conservatism. It's almost a luxury that for so much of the last 40 years, the two have been in sync.
What is the, do you have one issue, policy, or maybe even principle that you really would have disagreed with William F. Buckley?
Well, famously, he changed his mind on civil rights. He was the son of a Texas oil man. There's an editorial from 1957 in National Review that gets thrown at us all the time. I think it's ridiculous. I mean, the New Republic, which throws it at us, was openly pro-Soviet in 1935. But we don't respond to what they say about the child tax credit by saying, do you remember in 1935 when you were in favor of communism? But if you look back at Buckley, it's the big hit on him. What I think is far more interesting, though, is that he changed his mind, and he was open about why, and then in later years, he was happy to explain it. Yeah, I think that is his biggest mistake. I think he would have thought that was his biggest mistake. It didn't last very long, but it will always be brought up. So I would have disagreed on that. And then I think Buckley in the 70s was probably more satisfied with some of the economic decisions of the Nixon administration than I would have been. For example, there are supportive editorials in favor of wage and price controls. They were also rescinded. I mean, that was a good example of National Review changing its mind. And I'm lucky. See, this is the thing. It sounds so churlish when I say it, because I was born 10 years after those were written, so I have all of the luxury of looking through the mistake. They did all the work.
Do you think he was? Was there any politics beyond in terms of supporting Nixon, perhaps?
Perhaps. My read on it, and this is just my view, but my read on it is, let me digress slightly. So my wife and I, when we had our second kid and we would stay up all night because, babies are awake, we watched through the show Cheers, which I'd never seen in England. And one of the things that struck me is in the background in Cheers, when they go back into the room with the pool table, they have this poster on the wall and it says inflation busters, and it's drinks that are cheap. And that poster is there, for the first 3 or 4 seasons. And I looked it up, and that poster actually was a common feature in bars from about 1973 to 1982. Yeah. I mean, 9 years worth. No wonder Reagan won in a landslide in 1984 when finally this problem had gone away. It was something that affected the country in people's psyches for a decade. And I think that Buckley and others looked at this problem and were just so desperate to get out of it that they were willing to experiment. Mm-hmm. And then when it didn't work, they had no attachment to it, so they moved on.
So we've a couple questions. I'll go to some questions about education, higher education. So Buckley's first big foray into the public sphere is about education and Yale. Things presumably didn't get any better at Yale. There's a couple questions about the academy today, about higher education, and what would Buckley have to say, maybe as a prophet, because he already said it years ago. But is there anything, the two-part question, what would Buckley say about that? And then what do you see in higher education? Are there anything positive happening in higher education in the conservative movement from that perspective?
Yeah, so I don't want to speak for William F. Buckley or guess what he would have said. I do know that he never thought the problem had improved, and he died in 2008. Right. I think it's still fairly disastrous, to be honest, but I do think there are a few rays of light. One is that we now have some breakaway institutions. For example, in Texas, Barry Weiss has spearheaded this new college. We have a whole bunch of right-leaning or at least open-minded institutions on college campuses. So we have Civitas at the University of Texas, we have the Hamilton Center at the University of Florida, we have Skettle at the Arizona State University. These are organizations within universities that reject the monomania of the college in general. That is a good thing that didn't exist in that form 10, 15 years ago. I also think that, although it was not worth the cost, COVID did a favor to education reformers at all levels of education, in that for the first time, it allowed parents to look closely at what their kids were being taught. And by all accounts, those parents were horrified, and they started to question the value of the education, and in some sense, they started to push for changes. So I do see some hope in that regard. I'm not from Florida, you see, I'm so assimilated now. I'm a Florida man. They wipe our brains when we become one. But I live in Florida. I've lived in Florida for 8 years. My kids know nothing other than Florida. And the schools that they go to, I'm very proud of. I mean, I think the curriculum is very good there. The state legislature 2 years ago passed universal school choice. So irrespective of where you live, irrespective of your income, you can choose where your children go to school. Whatever the state spends on a child is what that child receives, whether they're a public school or private school or religious school or what you will. And that's the direct result of people having looked during COVID at what their kids were being taught. And I think something similar has happened in higher education. Obviously, there's less of a connection because most people in higher education aren't at home, but the costs have gone up so much. Student loans have inflated the cost of education to such an extent that people are asking whether or not it's worth it. And a lot of higher education is worth it. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-higher education, but I see more reform now on the horizon than I think existed during Buckley's life.
So here's a good question. How do I learn more about William F. Buckley? And do you have an opinion on the new biography? And I assume it's the one that was actually, do you have an opinion on that biography?
Well, to learn more about William F. Buckley, I would do two things. First, I would just watch lots of episodes of Firing Line, because I think that's probably the best distillation of the man. Also, National Review and the National Review Institute are engaged in a 100th anniversary program that is aiming to teach about Buckley's life. I mean, look, he was born 100 years ago. A lot of people under 30 don't know who he is and need to be taught. That's not their fault. He was born in the 20s. The biography... So Tannenhouse was an interesting choice of biographer.
Who chose him?
Buckley himself. But he was an interesting choice because he's not a conservative at all. The book took 27 years to write. There was one point at which the Tannenhouse contract for the William F. Buckley Jr. Biography was described as the greatest crime in literary history, because Tannenhouse signed the deal for it in the late 1990s and was paid in the late 1990s $500,000. So with inflation, that's got to be closer to $1 million. And then he just didn't do it. But he was the editor of the New York Review of Books. And so the question was, who's going to call him out on it? This is the guy who can make or break every other book. But he took 27 years to write it, and it's probably good that he did, because by the time that he had got into it in earnest, William F. Buckley Jr. had died. And it's probably better to write biographies about people when they're not alive. It's probably less awkward anyway. So he took a very long time. I think there's a lot about the book that is fair. I don't think it's a hit job. I don't think Tannenhouse was out to get him. It's an oddly structured book in that it sort of stops in 1990. There's nothing at all after that. But its big flaw, and this is maybe what you would expect from someone who has spent his life on the left, is that Tannenhouse is just not particularly interested in conservative intellectual history. And that's a problem when you're the biographer of someone who was responsible for the development of conservative intellectual history. And I think that is a problem. At no point does he try to get into Buckley's mind there. He almost sees him as being the product of external forces rather than taking seriously what it is that he did. But I would read it. I don't think it's a bad book. It's just a flawed book.
Is there a better biography on him?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Right. So, question, is Trump a conservative?
Well, yes and no. I mean, as I said earlier, conservatism has hosted people all across the spectrum, people who were for and against tariffs, people who were for and against foreign intervention, people who were for the free market and more skeptical of it. My Reaganite conservatism is probably still is the predominant form, but that doesn't mean that those who dissent aren't conservatives. And at the moment, they are, in some senses, regnant. And Trump is an expression of that. There are other ways in which Trump is not a conservative. I think dispositionally, he is not particularly conservative. The way he behaves, the way he talks, you would never associate with conservatives. He doesn't seem to think that it matters what has come before, which is a conservative instinct. And I think a lot of Trump is driven by instincts, and often those instincts are right, but he's not somebody who has spent much time thinking about the things that National Review, for example, has debated for 60 years. So I think the answer is yes. I also think the answer is no, and it will remain to be seen what happens in the remaining 3 years of his term. Where does he go with that? I think the first year, not quite, of his new term has been less traditionally conservative than the only 4 years of his first term. But perhaps he has to change course. I mean, this is a difficult question. I'm honestly not trying to split the baby here. I think Trump is an enigma. I find it very hard to get into his head, and people ask this all the time. I mean, what do you think of that? What do you think his philosophy is? I'm just not sure he has one. I think Trump is sui generis, and the idea that there is some sort of Trumpist movement that exists without Trump, I think is completely ridiculous. I think he is it, and that's not conservative, but that doesn't mean some of the things he does are not.
You are a constitutional scholar and a watcher of the courts, and there's a question about the courts. Did Buckley win the fight for the courts?
Well, it would be unfair to say yes in that other people did more. Eugene Meyer, who helped found the Federalist Society, Antonin Scalia was an absolute giant in changing minds here. But Buckley was part of that. National Review was part of that. Something I think is really interesting, this is a digression, but so I read a book that Antonin Scalia wrote in the 90s called A Matter of Interpretation. It's a brilliant book. And what's fascinating about the book to me is that Scalia thinks he's lost. So he lays out all of these incredibly forceful arguments in favor of his position, in favor of an originalist approach to the Constitution, a textualist approach to the law. He knows what he's against. And if you are of my persuasion, you listen to it and you think, wow, yes, that's what I believe right there. But then at the end, he makes all of these predictions about how he's going to lose. He's very depressed. And I think probably he died in 2016. He probably died thinking that. He probably died without knowing that he had won the argument, at least for now. That we have the most originalist court that we have had for 100 years. And Scalia didn't see it. And certainly that's true of William F. Buckley, who died 8 years earlier. Whatever he had hoped for the Supreme Court, he got nowhere near seeing. But I just think there's a life lesson in there. That authors, politicians, thinkers, they very often fail to see their ideas thrive. God, I'm blanking on the name now. I'm going to get deported for this. But Fitzgerald, F. Scott Fitzgerald. Scott Fitzgerald died thinking he was a failure. I mean, he died in relative obscurity. He'd been famous in the 20s by the time he died, and the US military sent a copy of The Great Gatsby out during World War II because it was a short book to soldiers who didn't have anything to do while they were waiting to be deployed or they were buried in trenches in France. And he died thinking he was a failure, and now, of course, he's taught in every school in the country. And I think when it comes to the courts, Buckley, Scalia, those who worked on that project, died thinking the same, but they were wrong.
So final question, where can people get more Charles C.W. Cooke?
Well, if you want more after this, you need your head looked at. But, well, you should listen to The Editor's Podcast. If you type The Editor's Podcast into any podcast app, you'll find it. It's released on Tuesdays and Fridays, and then I write at National Review. And if you have Twitter, I'm not calling it X, I'm too conservative, it's Twitter forever. I'm on there at Charles C.W. Cooke. And if after that point you have asked your doctor and he says it's fine to keep going, then you can follow me down my various rabbit holes. And
Charles, thank you so much. This is fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Charles Cooke.